The desert does not ask who you are. It only asks what you will do when the sun strips the world to bone and there is nothing left but decisions. Colt Morrison had been following a broken trail for 2 days, the dust imprint of lost cattle and the occasional drag of a rope telling a quiet story of a herd scattered by wolves or rustlers. His hat was turned low over his eyes. Whisky, his mare, small, gray, and stubborn in the way of horses that had learned every mile of a man's lonely life, poked at a salt flat and snorted. Heat shimmered above the hardpan, making the distant butte look like a boat on an ocean of air. The canyon walls gave no shade long enough to matter. They only bent light into a glare that felt like a question aimed at the throat. He had one horse. He had one reason to keep it, the long miles back to the town where a ranch, such as it was, would await him, the work that tied him to the land in no way softer than the heat itself. He had built his life on small steadies: repair a fence, brand a calf, mend a gait in a horse, and on Whisky's sure feet. In a world that took, a person learned to guard what kept him moving. He found the torn cloth first, a strip of blue gingham snagged on a thorn bush, fluttering like a small mute flag. Then, an overturned canteen, a few scattered beads of dried blood on cracked soil, a shoe with no foot inside. Colt's hand went, without thinking, to the butt of his pistol. The pistol stayed. The next step brought a figure half swallowed by scrub and sun. A woman, face sun-darkened, hair unbound and matted with dust, ribs whispered through her shirt as if the wind had read her like a map. She opened one amber-rimmed eye and looked at Colt as if she had been waiting. Breath came like a ragged bellows. He set Whisky down and moved slow. Haste would frighten the animal, and this fragile thing now clung to the light by thread. "You'll have to come up with a better lie than sunstroke," he said, voice low so as not to startle her, though he did not mean it to be a lie. He loosened the buckle of her canteen and tipped water between his palms. The liquid sloshed warm against lips that tasted of sand. "I'm Sina," she said. Her voice was a small instrument, used to being quiet. Not an apology, a name offered like a hand. Colt sat on a low rock and watched the world contract to the woman and the mare, to the slow, precious filling of her lungs. He was not given to openness. He had a map of the world made in taciturn lines. A man's job, a horse's needs, the fences that kept things from wandering. Hunger had taught him what charity looked like in small towns: an extra blanket, a jar of beans shared by the stove. What charity looked like out here had fewer committees and more immediacy. A saddle, a beat of hooves, a decision in the throat. "If I ride you out, you won't make it," he said. The truth in his mouth was a stone. "If I leave you, you might not be found." Sina's eyes closed against the sun, but she turned her face to him. "Then you will walk," she said, and the words came more as a fact than a plea. She did not make the plea he expected, not because she was proud, but because she was certain. Colt looked at Whisky. The mare's ears flicked. The animal had heard the same truth he had felt in his bones. A horse could carry a life. Colt felt the weight of his one steady possession settle alongside the weight of a stranger's life. The canyon air seemed to hold its breath. He took off the saddle. There are times when the body chooses what the mind has not yet decided. Colt swung the leather into his hands and walked around Whisky, who blinked as if to ask permission. He set the saddle across the mare's back, cinched it with steady fingers, and then lifted Sina with the same care he would have given a scrawny colt. She folded against him like a thing remembering having once been held. Whisky shifted, then stepped forward, carrying 2 people and 1 heart. "You don't have to," Sina began, but her voice ran out on the heat. Colt did not finish the argument. The horse's flank warmed against his palm. He thought of the distance back to the rim where a narrow trail dropped through scrub and thorn and the faint promise of smoke from the Apache camps. He thought of Whisky's steady bright eye and the work she had done for him, the crossings, the nights when lightning had flattened the plains and she had stood like a small island in the storm. He thought of being a man who measures value in the miles he can ride and the hours he can keep himself alive. He thought about leaving her to the sun. He walked. They left the mare at the edge of the rock, and Colt set his back to the sun and put the saddle across his shoulders like a burden no less real for its leather. Each step sank into loam and old bone. Sweat salted the line between his shoulder blades. His boots scuffed flat a path that would announce itself later to anyone who cared to trace the moment someone had done something that mattered. Sina did not ride. She walked beside him until her legs gave out. Then she clung to the saddle with hands that smelled faintly of smoke and sage, and Colt carried her raggedly. Once, when her breath stuttered, he knelt and kept water where she could drink a spoonful at a time. She laced a thin hand over his knuckles and did not ask his name. The desert was not for small talk. Wordless people saw things and stored them like rocks. When they told a story of a man who walked out of the sun carrying a woman on a warm saddle and without complaint, the telling would polish it like a stone in a river. But for now, the only witness was Whisky, who stamped her hoof and waited, patient as if all the proper measurements of a life were being observed. They crossed a wash where the rock was smooth as skin and the canyon narrowed. The world tilted to long shadows and an arid wind that smelled like old cedar. By dusk, when Colt could still feel the muscles in his calves, and the ache had not yet become a complaint, they crested the ridge to the low cluster of lodges and corrals that, if one could call such an arrangement a settlement, lay half hidden in the scrub. The Apache camp took up the hollow as if it had been waiting for such a purpose. Women mended nets, children wound toys from leather, the low hum of conversation braided with the crackle of a cooking fire. Horses moved in the pen with the dignity of animals who were kin to the people who tended them. A child pointed and was hushed by a hand. For a heartbeat, Colt felt the old frontier logic, guns, fences, suspicion, press against his spine. He had been taught to be wary of camps. Raids were not stories. They were a memory that made men sit forward at night. The world, his world, dealt in wary calculations. Yet the woman he had carried through the light lay light in his memory. He could have left her in the shade of the juniper and ridden on, returned to the ranch, and told a story of a woman found and not kept. Instead, he had walked, and now he stood on the cusp of strangers' lives. A few heads turned. A lanky young warrior, Dakota by the look of the feathers in his hair, stepped forward with arms folded and eyes like a hawk's. For a moment Colt imagined the man's thoughts. Why would a white man cross their line uninvited? What bargain did he come bearing? Dakota's face was impassive but held a sharpened edge. An elder rose from near the largest lodge. He carried himself with a quiet that suggested a weight of decisions. His hair ran silver along his shoulders, and when he moved, the camp seemed to rearrange itself as if by an unseen current. That elder came to Colt as a man comes to a river, slow, certain of the banks. He was called Thunder of the Sky, and when he spoke, everyone listened. Not because his voice carried loud, his voice was a measured thing, low and honed, but because a man who mouths law in a people's tongue commands attention, and Thunder of the Sky had eyes that took measure of a soul. He stepped into the open and regarded Colt with the same unhurried appraisal. "You bring trouble or truth?" Thunder of the Sky asked, his English soft as a lintel. His words were not a trap. They were the first map one offers a traveler. Colt thought the question was fair. He answered in the shortest language he had. "I brought what I had." The chief's gaze drifted to Whisky, then to the saddle spread across the man's back. Sina had been carried by the mare earlier. Now she lay on a pallet within the circle, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like sun and cedar. The camp's women had fussed over her with the efficiency of those who have saved a life before, and so know the tasks that must be done: water, heat, herbs pounded to a paste for fever. Sina's breaths lengthened and softened. Thunder of the Sky did not move like a man trying to impress a stranger. He moved like a man arranging the bones of a story already half told. He had the natural, undemonstrative gravity of someone who had made hard choices, and who expected others to make them too. "You left your horse," Dakota said, blunt and younger than the chief. The remark held suspicion under its bone. "Why give it to one who is not of your people?" Colt heard the accusation without a flinch. He had walked the path of quiet things long enough to know when an accusation was a shield and when it was simply a question asked to size up a stranger. "Because she would have died on my feet," Colt said, and there was no flourish in the way he said it. His voice had the steady honesty of one who had no need to dress a moment in grander terms than it bore. Sina lifted her head and met Dakota's glare. Her mouth was dry, her chin trembled. "You should be thanking him," she said, and the sound of her voice in the circle was like the small unloosing of a knot. "He did what we might do for one of our own." The camp's faces shifted. Some gave a near smile that was tied to the relief of a life saved. Others, like Dakota, held their wariness. In the arc of a people, displays of kindness from one not of the tribe were complicated, welcome to some, cause for caution to others. Thunder of the Sky's eyes moved from Colt to his daughter, then back to Colt. There is a ritual in all places about whom you can trust. In Thunder's world, trust was not lightly gifted. It was a ledger kept with memory and the weight of 1,000 winters. Yet a chief also knows when a moment invites a choice that reverberates beyond the small realm of his immediate household. You walked into our sun and did not take what was yours, Thunder of the Sky said. His voice held no mockery. You did not say you were brave. You did not ask for thanks. You walked because a life mattered more to you than your mount. Colt had no words ready as tribute. He had acted in a manner he had always thought reasonable. Perhaps that was why his chest was hollowed with a strange kind of relief. Politeness and honor sometimes wore the same clothing. He had expected a watchful silence, perhaps a ritualized rejection or a cautious hospitality. He had not expected the chief to stand as if rearranging his camp's future. Thunder of the Sky tapped a knotted staff against the earth, and 3 men stepped forward, elders, the sort whose faces were maps of decisions. They spoke in the Apache tongue for a long moment, heads bent, hands moving in the small gestures of a council that evaluates the weight of things. There was no display of sovereignty meant to cow a stranger. It was the practical assembling of minds tasked with navigating a moment. When they turned back, Thunder looked at Colt again. You will stay until dawn, he said. You will sit and speak nothing unless asked. Tomorrow we decide. Colt had expected to be made to leave, to be told the gates were closed. He had expected suspicion, perhaps a refusal disguised as hospitality. He had not expected a command that felt like an invitation. He nodded. That night, camp life creaked and settled. Smoke curled into the dark like a lazy animal. Children fought over a carved horse with the seriousness of heirs to a trade. A woman braided hair by a fire and watched Whisky with the affectionate scrutiny of a person who recognized a good mount when she saw one. Colt sat at the rim of a circle and did not move much. The weight of the saddle on his shoulders that he had carried all day now lay in his memory as a thing that had shifted something inside him. Sina, when she could sit without fainting, came to him with a small flat cup of broth. Her fingers brushed his knuckles in thanks and not in supplication. You have what you need to keep living, she said. You gave what you had. That is not small. Colt tried to answer, but his mouth kept pulling to words he had no use for. Instead, he accepted the broth and looked at her. Moonlight softened her face. There was absence there. Of anything like a claim to another man's life. There was also the hard, careful light of one who had walked many miles and learned the skills necessary to keep going. In the morning he was wakened by a sound he did not expect, the low thunder of hooves in some multiple. He blinked against the early sun and saw beyond the outer ring of lodges a line moving across the plain like the tide. 50 horses. They rolled like a dark wave across the lowland and paused on the ridge, heads high, manes catching the light. Colts and grays and bays and blacks shimmered in the moment's gold. Colt sat very still. He had ridden good horses. He had seen herds. He had never seen such a deliberate ceremonial tide arrive with the force of a declaration. Thunder of the Sky stood among his people, and for once his expression was unreadable. He stepped forward and met Colt's eyes as if asking him to measure this new thing. This is not for you alone, Thunder said, and his voice held a weight that filled the space between the corral and the horizon. It is for your people and for ours. It is a planting of a promise. Colt's hands trembled. He had expected gratitude in small measures. Grain, a blanket, perhaps shelter until the fever had left Sina's bones. 50 horses were a language he had not learned. A tide of animals meant to rewrite the ledgers of neighbors and enemies alike. People shift when they bear witness to generosity the size of a small flood. 1 horse was what you gave, Thunder continued. You gave what you needed. The balance of gifts is not counted in coin, but in the telling of what a people will be to one another. We hold horses. We know their value to a life with wide ranges. We give them so that there is a binding. Whispers rippled through the camp and beyond. Dakota stood stiff as a shaft. Sina rose from her pallet as if some current had moved her limbs. The horses stood like a forest of living things, scenting the air as if they, too, waited for some command. Colt stepped forward, though he ought to have stayed back. He had no words for the scale of the gift, and yet his chest pulled tight with a knowledge that this was a currency that stretched beyond ownership. It was an exchange of meaning, honor for honor, life for life, an answer to a question no one had asked out loud. "You cannot buy me," Thunder of the Sky said, not as admonition but as explanation. "You gave what a man should give when he finds a life in his hands. We give what our hands can offer in return, because our ways are not given to a single man. This is a communal standing. If you accept our obligation. If you refuse, we will take the horses back. We do not give what we do not mean." Colt's eyes moved over the line of animals, down to the calloused hands of the riders who had come with them, to the faces of men who had driven them. He thought for a moment of his small ranch, for the ledger he kept in his mind that measured what he could fix by hand. He thought of Whisky, the small mare who had carried 2 people through a day that might have been the ending of one life. He thought of the look on Sina's face, the way she had folded against a stranger and held on. There are acts that rearrange the topography of a man. This was one. He bowed his head. Words seemed clumsy like a sandal in a river. "I accept," Colt said, and the single syllable felt enormous. Around him, the camp's energy shifted. Some faces closed, as if at the sight of a bargain binding them to make choices with those they had once kept at arm's length. Some faces opened, surprised at the admission that reciprocity could build a bridge. Dakota's jaw worked. The youth had not yet reconciled pride with gratitude. In the town a half-day's ride away, mouths would shape themselves into questions and accusations. Men who had never thought to consider a chief's generosity as anything but an oddity would now have to answer for their own smallness. Sina came to stand between Colt and the nearest of the horses. She placed her hand on the flank of a bay mare and felt the animal breathe under her palm. The mare lowered her head in a familiar saddling of trust, as if it too knew the way the world could rearrange under a single honest act. "That was your horse," Sina said softly, not to scold but to remind. "You gave what you had." Colt looked at her, and for the first time in a long while did not have a story ready to shape his life into. The desert had asked a question. He had answered. Now, like a ripple in water, other questions came. The chief's soldiers moved the herd to a corral and began to unlade the tack. Men from the camp spoke in a low voice that Colt could not parse, faces lined and serious. The gift, so large, so unexpected, required decisions. Who would be given which horse, what terms, how the exchange would be counted. Thunder of the Sky walked to the edge of the corral and placed his staff in the dirt. His silhouette held the sun at his back like a halo that was practical and unsentimental all at once. "You will come to the council," he said to Colt. "You will sit when we call. Your people will ask questions. This gift carries eyes." Colt nodded. "I have no people here," he said. The words were not empty, they were precise. His ranch had ties, but he was the kind of man who had learned not to rely on many hands. The horses meant more than an asset. They were now a responsibility threaded into the life of a community that had extended its hand. Thunder of the Sky's expression softened a degree. "Then let the horses bind you to new people," the chief said. He said it without ceremony, as if to suggest that a life measured in small decent acts could become the soil where something new took root. Even in this moment of communal motion, there were hands that clutched tight to the old maps. In the town that was a day's hard ride away, Jack Dawson, a burly man with a disposition for scorn, would speak loudly in the saloon and make the gift a spectacle fit for mockery. Sheriff Ben Cooper, a man who valued peace though not always easily fomented it, would find himself stuck on the fence between the law of the town and the law of necessity. Dutch Williams, whose ranch lay near Colt's and who had held fast to the old suspicion of the Apache camp, would lean his weight into an opinion that might move him. The ripples had begun and would soon enough splinter against other rocks. At the corral, Colt found himself standing by Whisky, who had been tended by a woman named Nazi, who looked at the mare with the proprietary care of one who understood horses the way a carpenter understands wood. She cleaned a flank wound and hummed a small tune that sounded like a prayer made of coals and beets. Her hands moved with knowledge. The mare closed her eyes under the touch, as if the world could be repaired with having the right person touch the right place. Sina approached Colt with a saddlebag filled with seed and a strip of tanned hide. "We never meant to start a quarrel," she said, and then she gave him a look that was part apology, part daring. "But there is much to learn from one another. If you teach me to ride like a man that crosses the desert, I will teach you to read the signs of the sky." Colt's laugh came like a stone dropped into a well, small and clear. "I've ridden all my life," he said. "I don't know how much I can teach." "Then teach what you can," Sina replied. "Start with how not to be afraid of the plain." Her smile was a thin bridge. The horses stamped and shifted, a low chorus of breath and leg, and the small shuffling noises that mark large things trying to find place. The air smelled of dust and animal hair, and the faint iron of sweat. Conversation unspooled around them, which horses would be given to which families, what their uses would be, how this exchange could be used to weave a pattern so that no one would think this a mere act of charity but a new way of being neighbors. A rider came from the ridge with a message for Thunder. The chief listened, expression tightened like a drawn bow. "A storm," the messenger said. There were clouds to the west that had not belonged to this season, a dark roll far on the horizon that looked wrong. The man who had come carried himself with the prayer that the world might be turned into habit again, but the light was different. Thunder of the sky's jaw moved. Colt shifted as if some animal in him sensed change. The wind picked up with a quick, impatient breeze, sending dust into the horse's eyes. The distant dunes seemed to stir like a beast waking. In a few hours, the camp would find itself listening to another kind of question, how to hold to the world when the world itself turned against them. But for now, the moment held in a kind of silvered hush. 50 horses thrummed the air with possibility. A man who had given his only mount had unwittingly been offered a burden that would tie him to people he had not planned to become bound to. Sina stood near Colt, neither as prize nor as claim, but as a person who had been saved and now watched the consequence of that saving unfold. "You are not a man who seeks praise," Thunder said to Colt, voice low. "You are a man who does what must be done. It is good to have such men among us." Colt took off his hat and wiped his forehead. Sand had found its way under his collar, into his hair. He felt the saddle's absence as a hollowness that opened space for something he could not yet name. He looked over the herd, and then to the horizon where a faint gray band hovered like a bruise. The wind whispered of a change, and the camp's murmur shifted into plans. Where to shelter horses, which lodges could hold those who could not travel, who would watch the children if the wrong kind of rain came. There were 1,000 small motions in that morning, the clipping of rope, the fastening of bands, the quiet bargaining of two peoples facing a prospect that would ask them to move as one or be left apart. Colt felt the weight of the chief's gift settle into his life like a stone pushed into water. It would ripple outward, it would raise questions. He did not know then what the town would make of the horses, or how Dakota's distrust might widen into a rift, or whether Jack Dawson's mocking laughter would turn to something more dangerous. He did not know what sheltering 50 horses would require of the ranch he had barely kept. He did not know whether the storm on the far horizon would sweep down as rumor or as ruin. But he had given his horse, and the chief had answered with 50. The exchange was enacted under the sun, and would be measured not in coin but in consequences. It was a binding that none of them had asked for, and that, now that it stood between them like a road, would be walked by more than one set of feet. At the edge of the corral, Sena placed a hand on Colt's arm. "Some gifts are meant to be returned," she said, and the sentence hung between them like a promise and a warning. "But some gifts are meant to bind, so that we will not forget the debt of having been saved." Colt looked at her, at the horses, at Thunder of the sky, whose face had a softness now that he had settled a matter of honor. He had walked into danger and given up his most faithful possession to save a life. He had expected little more than a nod, perhaps shelter and food. He had received instead a pledge the size of a herd. The unexpectedness of the chief's reaction tasted like the first bite of cold water after a long dry day, startling, necessary, and hard to swallow in one gulp. As the sun climbed, the camp moved to organize the gift, making lists and assigning riders. Holland, a man from the ranch down the road whose small pride was matched only by his thrift, would be called upon, and Sheriff Ben Cooper would be sent word. In town, talk would spin wild like tumbleweed. The world Colt lived in, The world of fences and ledgers and small fierce loyalties was about to be remade by a single honest act and an even single larger one in return. The line of 50 horses stood in the morning light as if an impossible tide had frozen mid-turn. Colt felt the truth of it all press against his lungs. One horse had saved a life. 50 horses might save something larger. But between saving a life and saving a town lay the complex work of trust. And the sky, away to the west, had begun to bruise. The bruise on the western sky widened like the welt from a hand. Wind fingers raked the low grass. The sun slid behind a thin sheet of dust that refused to be only rumor. By noon, the camp moved with the urgency of people who know how quickly weather becomes a verdict. Ropes were coiled and doubled. Women walked the lines of pens checking knots. Children were called in from the edges of the hollow, their games abandoned for the steadier work of preparing. Colt woke to the sound of the herd's restless breathing and the hollow roar that had begun far off and now crawled toward the world. He dressed with the same economy he used for his life. Shirt on, boots tied, the leather of his belt warmed and familiar under his hand. Whisky stood nearby, secure in the care she had been given the night before by Nazi. The mare watched him like an old friend who knows when a man needs to be steady. Sina met him by the corral, a cord of braided hide in her palm and a small bundle of sage. Her hair was smoothed back. There was a steadiness to her face that had not been there when she first woke in the camp. The morning's events had drawn lines in her, lines not of fear, but of a resolve that learns to work with what is given. "The sky says the wind will not be a passing annoyance," she told him. "We will need the animals sheltered. They must not breathe the sand more than is necessary." Colt nodded. "Where do you want the mares?" he asked. He did not ask for directions to prove anything. He asked because he knew she had knowledge he did not. Sina pointed to a thicker-walled corral closer to the lodges. "There, and double the latches. Tie their heads low so they do not rear when their eyes sting. Keep water close. The sand will make them blind quicker than fear." They worked without ceremony. Colt's hands, used to fixing fences and leather, moved with the same competence around horses that Sina's hands used for the signs of the land. She showed him how to braid a flap of rawhide into a temporary hood to protect a stallion's eyes, how to tuck blankets at the chest so the sand would not scrape a flank raw. Colt watched. He learned. It was not a lesson born of inference but of exchange. Sina's instructions were efficient. Colt's responses were grateful. The camp prepared as one body. Thunder of the sky stood in the center like a rock in a river, issuing calm lines of command. Men took posts at the outer ring with lassos ready. Meals were shortened and shared, hot stew ladled into tin bowls so hands would have strength. A few elders moved quietly, blessing doorways in their own tongue, gestures offered less out of superstition than habit. Humans often press ritual into the seams of the unknown to make their steps steadier. Beyond the hollow, the town's horizon slanted into a darker smear. Word travels in a desert as if by whisper networks. Riders on a ridge, a child sent back to fetch a parent. Colt knew the route that would lead him toward the ranch and then to the town. He had imagined a man's life where events were spaced apart and fathomable. Now the world would conspire to teach him what it meant to have neighbors beyond fences. Someone from the town arrived at the camp riding hard, a courier with a dust-darkened face and the thin dignity of a man who carries news that will change decisions. Sheriff Ben Cooper came not as a conqueror, but as a man who had been called to stand between law and weather. He wore the law's badge, but not the swagger that sometimes came with it. His horse's flanks were tight with exertion. "You have 50 horses," the sheriff said without preface. Breath steamed in the cooler of the approaching storm. He looked to Thunder, then to Colt. His voice aimed to hold the distance between the two worlds. "Word goes quick? There's talk in town. Folks want to know what arrangements have been made." Thunder's gaze met his even. "We gave what our people could give," the chief replied. "We ask only that those horses be used to bind us in practical ways, not as trophies, but as ties. If a man among you takes one and flees to mockery, we will consider it a broken promise." Sheriff Cooper listened. He had the balancing act of lawman and neighbor to perform. "We'll need to settle who receives what," he said slowly. "There are families here who might need a horse, and some who might not want what men think they're owed." Colt stayed where he was, hands resting on Whisky's neck. He felt the quiet gravity of the situation. A herd redistributed is not merely logistics, it is a reweaving of obligations. He thought of the ranch's lean barns, of the fence lines he tended alone. 50 horses would require work, grazing rotation, water points, guards against theft, and they would also shift the town's politics in ways he did not yet map. Back in town, Jack Dawson wasted no time turning the gift into fuel. The saloon's wooden floor took the stomp of men's opinions as easily as horse hooves took to soft ground. He made his mockery loud and rough, calling the chief's generosity a stunt, a ploy to bind white men into awkward loyalty. His words found easy lodging with those who feared any change to the old patterns. "You give a herd away and expect the world to forget who handed out favors," Jack jeered as men laughed. "What's next? Them asking for the sheriff's badge at the council and a cut of our cattle?" Dutch Williams, who had always held his fences close and eyed the Apache camp with suspicion, listened with a mouth going thin. He had been taught a ledger's language: debts, credits, survival by measure. The sight of Colt, his neighbor, the quiet man who kept odd working hours, standing linked with Thunder's camp, had unsettled his ledger. "You think we should take their horses and spit in their faces?" Dutch grunted to a friend, voice nearly private. He did not know if he could admit to himself that the herd made the town smaller, pressed upon it with a new reality. Dutch had the kind of mind that could be moved slowly by practical demonstration. In the back of his head, he held the memory of a winter where frost ate calves and he had scraped for food. Those memories loosened something. Sheriff Cooper rode from the town to speak plainly with Jack and a few others who pushed the more dangerous edges of opinion. He asked for patience, for the rule of law to be allowed to breathe before men acted on suspicion. His pleas were not peaceable only because law commanded it. He knew the town's dirt in the way one knows the names of the horses. He also knew that when nature threatened, petty feuds tended to either melt away or become the kindling for deeper blows. Dakota watched all of this from the camp's perimeter like one who tracks the weather by feeling it on his skin. He had been the sharpest in questioning Colt when the mare had been left. The young warrior's wariness had softened but not vanished. He eyed the town's reaction with a kind of judgment that had to do with honor and the protection of his people. "You give your horses away to a people who laugh at us?" he asked one afternoon to Sena, hands on the braid of his hair. "They will think us weak. We cannot be weak." Sena did not answer with the impatience of youth. "Strength is not measured by how tight one holds a thing," she said. "It is measured by the hands you give when another's need is plain. We will not make ourselves small to fit their fear. We will use the horses so that both our worlds are steadier." Dakota's jaw tightened. He was not convinced, yet he was beginning to watch Colt with a different set of eyes. The man who had walked the desert might not carry a clan's stories, but he carried steady hands and a refusal to claim favor. Dakota watched the steadiness, and it made him think of other steady things. His father, who had trained horses with a quiet hand, the way a good steed snagged a herd from relapse. The sky darkened further. The air seemed to shrink, the sun a coin pressed under the thumb of a fist. Then the storm hit. It arrived as a wall of rot, sand like ash blown in from 100 bad places, a press of grit that erased edges and turned every cry into a swallowed sound. The first impact was physical, sand flung into faces, into mouths. The world narrowed to the task of breath. Horses reared, children clung to bodies. For a moment, everyone acted on the simplest law. Find shelter, keep the animals close, do not let panic decide who will live. Sena's voice cut through the roar. "Bring them to the low corral, tie heads, tie low." Colt moved as if muscle memory had been waiting for this exact moment. He zipped into the corral, finding panic in the horse's eyes and answering with a calmness that worked like a hand on a frayed rope. He tied knots he had taught Dakota and men had used at rodeos and brandings, knots that would hold when the world thrashed at the rope. Thunder of the Sky organized people at the camp center. He sent elders to gather the lodges and move children within the deepest shadow. He did not need to shout. A chief's voice carries because his people have learned to align their bodies with it. Men and women moved as if by practiced choreography, mothers holding children, seasoned hands flinging tarps over delicate things. The storm pushed like an animal with a mind. Sand blew into eyes and ears. It ground at the leather of saddles and the soft places between hoof and hair. visibility lessened to the width of an arm. Colt could feel his skin roughen under the constant battering. His mouth tasted of iron and grit. He shouted, not loud but steady, because a steady voice matters more than a loud one when panic lurks. Through the tide of grit came cries, shouts, a baby crying, a woman's panicked call. A rider from town who had attempted to cross to the camp with a warning found his horse balking and thrown off. He called for help in a tone that broke loose the human instinct to hoard yourself. Colt heard the call and followed it by instinct. He found the rider half buried against a low lip of rock, his horse tangled in straps, flailing. Colt plunged a hand into the sand, found a rein, felt the animal's hot side against his palm. He worked with a calm that somehow held under the world's confusion. Sina arrived at his shoulder, wind-blown hair like a flag. Together they eased the rider free. Dakota arrived soon after, coughing, face streaked with dust. He had been called by a different cry, the sound of Dutch William's youngest son, trapped under a fallen awning near the town's outer board. The young warrior moved with a purpose that had been sharpened into a blade. He reached down and handed the child to a waiting arm. Dutch, appearing out of the dust and fear, took his son trembling and felt a rush of gratitude that unhooked some of his old prejudices. When the storm had its worst hour and then spent itself like a beast tiring, the people were left with a landscape rearranged. Lodges had been crushed, fences lay in heap, a roof had come down in one of the town's outer houses. Horses coughed, mouths raw from sand, one filly was lost. But they were alive and together, and the shared work of tending the wounded made some other things impossible to keep. The small hostilities, the careless mockeries. In the aftermath, the camp found its breath, and the town found its humility. There were small scenes of human tenderness, Sheriff Cooper helping to clear a collapsed stall, Dutch Williams, his hands raw, working alongside Nazi to fashion a splint for a horse's leg, Dakota sitting quiet with a boy and teaching him the way to hold a rope so it did not cut a palm. Colt moved among these laboring bodies like a man whose life had been made necessary by the scene. He carried water, he set a splint, he learned from women who had known how to fashion poultices. Sina pulled him aside when she could find a private moment, and they exchanged what had been unspoken in the storm, the fiercer undercurrent of respect. You held my people's hands steady, she said softly, the sand still in the hollows of her neck. You did not pretend you knew everything. You asked, and you learned? Colt looked at her, and realized that what had begun in the trade of life for a horse had been deepened by that day of danger. You taught me how to read the wind, he answered. You taught me to listen to horses in a way I did not before. Their smiles were small, private things, an intimacy grown out of risk and practical mutual aid rather than a spectacle. They shared moments of quiet. A bowl of broth passed between them in a dim tent, Sina showing him how to smooth a braid of hair away from the forehead of a sleeping child, Colt leaning a shoulder against the post as he watched her work. Word of the storm's consequences reached the town fully, only as people rode in to check on their own. The sight of men from the town and the camp jointly tending the worst places forced a reckoning. Jack Dawson's sarcasm had less room to breathe in a world where he might yet owe his life to those he derided. He still found venom when he wanted it. Old habits are stubborn, but the sting had less purchase. Sheriff Cooper called a meeting. It was not a courtroom hammering a gavel so much as a town and a camp convening to decide what to do next. Thunder of the Sky stood on one side, Colt beside him, Sina present too. The townsfolk gathered on the other side. Dutch, Sheriff Cooper, a few ranch hands, and men whose faces were set with deliberation. There is a formality to agreements that are meant to last. It does not need elaborate ceremony. It needs clarity and a willingness to live by what is decided. Thunder's voice when he spoke at the council was measured. He framed the gift again, not as a payment, but as a pledge. We gave horses so that when the wind takes the land, we can stand closer, he said. We give them to be used for warning and for hauling, for work, and for producing foals that will be shared among children on both sides of the ridge. We ask that in return you watch for the signs of drought and storm at your fences and send for help when you see them. We ask that the horses be used to bind us by work and by watch. Dutch, after a silence that felt long and thoughtful, spoke first for the town. His voice was different than it had been in the saloon, less performative, more honest. We have always held to our ledgers, he said. If what you ask is to be a patrol for the plain and a sharing of beasts so they do not die for lack of water, then we accept. But these things require labor and not just words. We will need to know who watches which watering holes and how offspring are apportioned. Dakota listened, the younger warrior's stance easing. His questions were less skeptical now and more practical. How would the horses be bred? Who would care for them through a lean winter? How would conflicts be settled? Thunder answered each with the sort of common sense that belied a long practice of communal living. We will form a council with 2 men and 2 women from each community, he said. They will mark the grazing rights and keep the herd records. There will be no quick claims. A foal born to a mare given to a town family will belong partly to that family and partly to the camp. It will be trained, and the training will teach both our people to work with new hands. Sheriff Cooper, pragmatic and invested in peace more than in any ideology, added the town's voice. We will put a shared corral near the line. We will put up watches. We will not tolerate theft or insult. The law will stand, but we will let these agreements be the first step to avoid a need for law. It was not utopia. Some men grumbled that the idea of sharing a foal was impractical. Others worried that the horses would be used as weapons in raiding. But the council's work was to deal with hard edges by sanding them down into practical things. They agreed on watch rosters, shared wells to be dug deeper, and a group that would ride the ridge at the first sign of storm. The agreement would be enforced not only by law, but by shared dependence. In private, Thunder called Colt aside. The chief's manner was soft now, as if a heavy knot in his chest had been loosened by the day's events. You made a choice that asked nothing of us in return, he said. You did not expect a herd. That makes us careful with what we give, but you have worn the work that goes with it. That is what binds. Colt felt the weight of the herd shift into something less like an obligation and more like a shared trust. I will do what I can, he said. I do not know the ways of a council like yours, but I will learn. You have already begun, Thunder said. A council is only good when the men who sit at it bring the kind of steadiness you showed in the storm. As days passed and the wound of the storm closed, the 2 communities began the slow, patient work of turning an agreement into habit. Riders met at dawn and at dusk. A smith from town taught a young man from the camp how to nail a shoe in a new way. Sina taught Colt how to read the sky to see the difference between storm that will pass and storm that will settle in like a long illness. Colt showed Dakota a knot to hold a rope when a foal thrashes. Relationships bloomed in the shelter of practical work. Dutch Williams, whose fingers had once caressed a ledger more than a bridle, found himself sharing a quiet cup with Nazi, who told him about a winter she'd known where a stallion pulled a sled through a snowbank and kept a family alive. Dutch listened, and his ledger shifted in small degrees. Jack Dawson watched these changes with the sour confusion of a man used to owning the narrative. He still mocked sometimes, but the barbs grew fewer and the gatherings larger. A man whose son had been saved by Dakota's hand was not likely to continue to champion mockery loudly. Some grudges dissipated, not because they were easy to let go, but because they had become impractical. Colt and Sina's relationship deepened in the steady ways of 2 people whose days overlapped in meaning. They trained horses together, often at dawn when the plain held its breath and the light made a gold seam along the horizon. Sina taught Colt how to feel a mare's mood in the shift of the hindquarters, to know by a flick of an ear when a horse suspected something a man had not seen. Colt taught Sina to ride a different seat in the saddle for long miles, the small adjustments that keep a rider unspent. There were quiet evenings too, times when the work was done and the world allowed a relaxation. They sat near a fire, shared the small confidences others might call story. Sina spoke of her childhood as one learning the careful art of horse breeding, the names of mares that had been part of her family's line. Colt spoke in narrower lines, about fences he had mended, about how his father had taught him to keep a ledger of chores as a way of keeping life from unraveling. Their confessions were mutual building. One evening, as the sun fell slow and the herd grazed like a dark river at rest, Sina asked Colt a question that had been forming like a seed. "When you walked with the saddle on your shoulder," she said softly, "did you think you would have to carry other burdens afterward?" Colt looked at her, at the way the light made her face a thing of lines. He traced, with the length of his thumb, the seam where the leather had been, now a place of memory more than loss. "I did not think about the long terms," he admitted. "I thought about the next step and that was enough. but now that the herd is here and the town is tied into it, I think about being part of something that does not end at my fence. I like the idea, strange as that may sound. Sina's hand found his. Their fingers fit in a way that did not require words. In that small touch there was consent, a mutual acceptance that had matured through hardship and steady reciprocal labor. They did not rush a proposal. Love in these parts was not a dramatic line cut across a saloon floor. It was a decision made over time, marked by promises kept, and days stood beside one another. Colt waited until the work demanded of him was met, until he could offer not only sentiment, but the surety of a man who would keep his word. Sina, who had been wary of men who claimed much and offered little, watched Colt and saw a man who had given first without calculation, and who had continued to act in ways that steadied others. When he asked Thunder's counsel, the chief did not fashion an edict, but offered a blessing. He watched the two, saw their tenderness matched by mutual competence, and recognized what it meant in the context of the larger alliance. If two people can bind themselves as you intend, Thunder told Colt in private, they can be living proof to both our people that the pledge we have made is not folly. Colt and Sena married in a ceremony that was small and public, held at the edge of the hollow where both camps could gather. It was not a performance intended to erase history, it was a communal acknowledgement of something new. The ceremony honored both their worlds in ways that were particular and sincere. Thunder of the Sky gave his blessing with the weight of years and the clarity of a man who knew which gestures mattered. He handed Colt a spindle of braided hide, an old cord used in his family to stitch saddles, and he gave Sena a strip of Colt's leatherwork, stamped with a careful notch that would be recognized among ranch hands as a maker's mark. They exchanged words not meant to impress outsiders, but to declare an intention, to be partners in the tangible work of life, to protect, to teach, and to build together. Young warriors and elder ranchers stood side by side as the vows were made, and the two communities watched a union form that was not meant to erase identity, but to build a shared place where distinctions did not have to become walls. There were tears, some from grief at what had been lost, some from joy at what had been forged. The 50 horses, those rivers of living backs, were present like witnesses, their hooves stamping the ground in a steady rhythm. After the vows, the herd was put through a small rite of passage. Foals were led into the corral, children were given small rides under careful supervision. Elders taught the youngest hands how to approach a horse without fear. Those who had been suspicious before touched noses with an animal they had once thought of only as another family's commodity. The transformation was not instantaneous, but the scene effected a change so deep that even the most stubborn skeptics had to reckon with it. The chief's gift, once an astonishing and almost incomprehensible tide of animals, settled into being a living network. The council met often, as the first seasons demanded. There were disputes, over grazing rights, over foals that seemed to be more attaché to one family than another, but mechanisms for resolving them were now in place. Shared wells were dug deeper and fenced. Watch rotations meant the town and the camp had eyes on each other's borders. When rustlers came testing attempts in a later season, those eyes were enough to warn both communities to ride together and to drive the thieves off. The alliance proved itself not as a shield from all harm, but as a collective muscle that could be called upon. Life, of course, remained complicated. Not every man and not every woman welcomed the change with equal eagerness. There were resentments that did not vanish. Small acts of meanness continued as a satellite of human failing. But the larger trend was toward cooperation, and the daily work of sharing slowly eroded the harder ridges of suspicion. One summer dusk, Colt and Sena stood together on a slight rise and watched a full gambol among older mares. Children from both sides rode on their parents' backs, their laughter carrying like a sound that could burn away old resentments. Thunder of the Sky walked slowly beside them, his presence as steady as a mountain. He watched the children, and then smiled in a way that had been absent in certain seasons past. "You have changed this place," he said to Colt, not in praise but in the recognition of the truth. "Not because you sought to, but because you did what your heart bent you toward. That is how a people mend." Colt looked out at the herd, the town's ridgeline, the smoke plumes from the far reaches of ranches, and felt a fullness unlike anything he had kept inside him before. The loss of Whisky had been a real thing. The mare had been more than a mount to him. He missed the small companion in the night when a man's life is measured by the sounds of breathing. But that loss had been the cause of something larger, an exchange that made the future look possible in ways solitude had not. Sina reached for Colt's hand, weaving her fingers with his. "We have work," she said lightly, and then, with a gentleness that had grown like a small plant pushed by light, "But there is also life to live beside it." They married fully in public. They promised practical things and tender ones. The chief's blessing sealed an alliance that would outlast any single man's life. Children would be born who would know both languages, who would ride from pasture to pasture without a thought for division. The 50 horses, once a strange flood, had become a herd with babies, with lineages that would intertwine both people's futures. In the years that followed, the plain kept testing them. Drought returned sometimes, and winters gnawed more than once at the supply. Yet the watch system and shared rotas of riding kept cattle and people safer than they had been. A boy from the camp and a girl from the town once rode together to drive a small herd across a pass, and the scene was one of those images that tethered new stories to old practices. Jack Dawson continued to grumble. He had not been transformed into a saint by any miracle, and he still loved the saloon more than the idea of communal justice. But his son, who had been carried out of a collapse by Dakota's hands, grew up with a friendship that smoothed some of his father's harder edges. Dutch William's grudging respect for the camp became genuine as he saw Nazi's quick hand save a mare that might have been his. Dakota, who had once bristled at Colt's intrusion, became one of the young leaders on the combined watch roster. He rode with a seriousness born of experience, and his small arrogance tempered into a steady pride for a community that had chosen to hold others close. He never stopped being proud of his people's way, but he learned that one can hold pride without closing the hand entirely to others. As for Colt and Sina, they built a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. They kept a house near the edge of the hollow, a place where both visitors from the town and travelers from the camp could find a bed. Sina taught Colt to braid leather in a particular pattern used in her family. Colt taught Sina how to temper a bit of metal for a horseshoe. In winter nights, with the wind scouring the plains and the horses huddled in their safe corral, they would lie awake and speak of small things. The name of the next foal they hoped would be born, the route to a spring their council wanted to protect. The child who had learned to say both their names in a tumble of small tongues. Years had a way of simplifying complexity. The headline that might once have read in a town paper, "He gave up his only horse for an Apache woman," would in time read more like a long line in a ledger. An entry noting a gift that had changed a line of fences and set up a mesh of obligations. It would be a story told to children by people who preferred things to be remembered with the fondness of those who lived through them. On a late afternoon when the sun was a slow coin melting into the land, Colt walked with thunder of the sky to a small knoll where the herd grazed like a moving curtain. The two men had come to share a silence easy between them. Thunder, older now, carried his staff but moved with a lightness that told more about a life lived than about age. "You did not seek reward," Thunder said. "You answered a human call. Many will speak of the herd as my gift. But you should know, gifts are given by many hands. It would not have been possible without the women who kept the mares, the smith who worked the bits, the boys who rode through weather. An exchange is always larger than the two who begin it." Colt looked out at the 10,000 small movements of life below, foals stacking their awkward legs, children throwing sticks into the dust, men and women patting the necks of mares. "I know that now," he said. "I see it. I did not before." Thunder smiled. "Then that is the measure of the gift," he said. "Not the number of the horses, but the number of hearts that learn to beat together." As the light fell, the 50 horses rose in a slow tide and moved across the plain, the herd's motion like a breathing thing that belonged to both camps. Colt felt the old ache where Whisky's absence lived, but he felt a companionable joy too. The knowledge that by giving away his own small anchor, he had loosened the world's edges enough for new hands to weave a net. Sina found him there on the knoll and laid her head against his shoulder. They watched the herd as the sky swallowed the last of the light. Children's laughter pulled at them, and somewhere, a drum from the camp tapped an old rhythm that was both a song and an instruction. Remember, hold, give. The story of a man who gave his only horse for a dying woman had begun in a small immediate act. The chief's response, 50 horses and a pledge, had been unexpected because it was big and because it refused to treat kindness as a thing to be hoarded. It had been an answer offered in the oldest language people know, reciprocity. When the night pressed down, the hollow hummed with the soft sounds of domestic life, horses breathing, a baby's soft murmur, two people whispering. The alliance would not erase every old sorrow, it would not fix history, or remove the ache of all past wrongs. But it had created a place where two peoples could stand side by side and say, with hands that had learned to work in the same language, that they would look after one another. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who loves tales of the frontier and quiet courage. If you'd like more stories like this, of small acts that change the world, subscribe and stay for the next one.